Sudan's Civil War: Origins and Outcomes by David Kissin and Aidan Smith. For nearly 4 decades, the country of Sudan has been ravaged by civil war. There have been more casualties during the course of the civil war than all the casualties of Angol, Bosnia, Chechnya, Kosovo, Liberia, the Persian Gulf, Sierra Leone, Somalia, and Rwanda combined. Over the course of the war, there has been an estimated amount of 2 million dead and 5 million displaced and at risk. Many people have asked the question, why? In order to answer this question, we must look into Sudan's history, geography, and demographics. Islamic conquerors first came to Sudan in the 7th century and found that many of the people had already been converted to Christianity. War ensued between the Islamic conquerors and the native people, followed by a stalemate between the two that lasted about 1,000 years. In 1820, the Ottoman Empire took control and enslaved 30,000 people, known as Sudan, which meant simply black. In 1898, the British Empire began its reign in Sudan. They ruled the Muslim North and the Christian South as 2 separate regions, until they left in 1956, at which time they put the Muslim North in control of the whole country. Conflict between the North and the South began in 1955 and intensified when the British left Khartoum, Sudan's capital city. This conflict ended in 1972, when the South was granted regional autonomy through the passing of the Addis Ababa Agreement. Peace lasted until 1983, when President Numari imposed Sharia law on the whole country and denied the South autonomy that had been promised in 1972. This was the start of a second civil war, a war that lasted until 2005. Religion differences were not the only factor in the start of the Second Civil War. Geography and natural resources also played a part. North Sudan is near the Sahara Desert, and thus is more arid and dry, while the South is rich in grasslands and tropical rainforests. The South is also rich in oil and minerals. Despite this wealth and natural resources, the stock remained largely undeveloped. Race, religion, and the desire to control the wealth of the nation led to what has been called the greatest human tragedy in recent history. The flight and death of millions, the tragedy of the lost boys, and the devastation of Darfur. In 1983, when the Second Civil War began, many people began to flee from their homes to neighboring countries. Many of these people were boys, some as young as 5 years old. These boys walked across Sudan, many dying along the way to a refugee camp in Ethiopia. They left the devastation of their homeland, only to find equal devastation in the refugee camps. Often, after arriving at the camps, many of the older boys, who were stronger, were recruited into Sudan People Liberation Army, SPLA. Fighting soon broke out in Ethiopia, and the refugees were forced to flee once again, this time to Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya. Once again, these lost boys found themselves on a long, arduous journey, on foot. Along the way, they saw many of their companions dying from disease, wild animal attacks, starvation, and dehydration. Many of the tabs on which they stopped along the way were used by the SPLA as a recruiting point for child soldiers and laborers. When they finally reached Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya, they once again found the conditions to be a little better than those they had just left. In Kakuma, they received food rations, medical care, and schooling. However, the food rations and medical care were very minimal due to the corruption in the management of the camp. Also, due to the Kenyan laws forbidding refugees from holding jobs, they were often little more than prisoners in refugee camps. Because of the continuation of the war, the Lost Boys grew to adulthood in refugee camps in the late 1990s. The US and other nations began a relocation program to assist some of these lost boys. Though many of the boys had been successfully relocated, many still remain in the refugee camps. In 2003, the next great tragedy occurred. When conflict broke out in Darfur, the conflict in Darfur differed from the conflict between the North and South, because all Darfurians are Muslim, so religion did not play a part. Instead, this conflict dealt with ethnicity, natural resources, and power. According to the UN, 2.7 million people had been displaced and 300,000 people killed. In 2004, this conflict was defined as a genocide by President George W. Bush and his cabinet. This definition helped spur the social movement to save Darfur. In 2008, the International Criminal Court charged President al-Bashir with war crimes. In 2005, the conflict in Darfur ended, and the North and South signed a Comprehensive Peace Agreement, or CPA. As a part of the agreement, the South was allowed to begin governing itself and was given the opportunity to vote on issues of succession. In January 2011, as agreed upon in the CPA, the South voted to succeed and became a nation unto itself, thus beginning the birth of the newest nation. On July 9, 2011, the Republic of South Sudan was declared a sovereign state. On the same day, Salva Kiir Mayar was sworn in as the nation's first official president, even though he had been serving as president since 2005. Despite continued border-top skirmishes and conflicts, the Republic of South Sudan is making strides to improve their government, secure peace, and increase their economy.
Following up on what David touched upon, we are covering the Sudanese Civil War, and right now I'll be touching upon what caused the conflict. So, in 1983, a military regime tried to impose Sharia law as part of policy to Islamicize Sudan. Conflict between the central government was risen because of the Sharia law being imposed, and this conflict was shown in Khartoum, which is the capital of Sudan, and it was fought by the Sudan People's Liberation Army. The war started in southern Sudan, but spread to other places, including the Nuba Mountains and the Blue Nile region. The terms of the Addis Ababa Agreement in 1972, which ended the First Sudan Civil War, were violated several times. In 1978, President Gafar Nimeiry wanted to take control of the newly discovered oil fields located on the border region between what is now North and South Sudan. In 1983, President Nimeiry violated the agreement by imposing Sharia law across the nation and abolishing the mostly Christian Southern Autonomous Region. Most South Sudanese people and other people who were non-Muslim living in the north were now punished by Sharia law. This is the responses to violence category. Rebels from South Sudan rapidly formed an army called the Southern People's Liberation Army and nominated John Garang as their leader. Both Southern rebels and the government military forces recruited child soldiers, just like what happened in the First Civil War. In 1985, a coup occurred that did away with Gafar Nimeiry, who was the current president of Sudan. When the coup happened, the remaining government got rid of the decree Nimeiry made in 1983, and at the same time wrote other treaties in an effort to repair the North and South get rid of Nimyari's efforts to make Sudan an Islamic state, and disband Nimyari's Southern Sudan Socialist Union. In May of 1986, with the SPLA headed by Colonel John Garang, the Sadiq al-Mahdi government alliance initiated diplomatic efforts. The SPLA and a number of Sudanese political parties met in Ethiopia that year and agreed on the declaration of the Coca Dam, which pushed ahead the abolition of Islamic Sharia law and the holding of a constitutional conference. Now I will be stating the 1991 Criminal Act. In March of 1991, the Criminal Act of 1991, a revised consequential procedure, introduced the extreme penalties nationally, including amputations and stoning. While these Islamic restrictions and punishments were legally suspended from the southern states, the 1991 law established for a potential future introduction of Islamic Sharia law in the South. In 1993, most non-Muslim judges were moved from the South to the North by the government, swapping them with Muslim judges in the South. The Sudan People's Liberation Army occupied large parts of the provinces of Equatoria, Bahr al-Ghazal, and Upper Nile, and portions of the provinces of Darfur, Kordofan, and Blue Nile. A number of the major southern towns and cities, including Juba, Wau, and Malakal, were controlled by the government too. In October of 1989, an informal ceasefire in May broke down. A government attack seized southern Sudan in July of 1992 and seized the headquarters of the SPLA in Torit. Now I'll be moving into the impact on civilians and casualties section. So, about 2 million died because of the violence directly from war, famine, and disease. Since 2003, violence in Darfur, called ethnic cleansing by some and genocide to others, has left an estimated 50,000 to 80,000 dead and an estimated 1.2 million to 2 million people displaced. Survivors face severe shortages of food and clean water. This war also has displaced roughly 4 million people from their homes at least one time, meaning that some people were displaced from their homes multiple times. The civilian death toll is the highest since World War II and can be drawn alongside numerous human rights violations and violations of war. The spread of malaria was also expedited by the war, along with cholera and HIV being spread rapidly by the war. Simple access to food and water was extremely difficult during the war, on top of an actual basic food shortage that was striking the nation previously. An estimated 200,000 Sudanese have escaped to Chad, where they are living in refugee camps. Many are in desolate areas near the city of Abeche, where temperatures frequently exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Sudan finally freed itself of the burden of polio, the burden that polio had caused in 2001. Although they had beat polio in 2001, it made a resurgence as a result of the war, leaving roughly 10,000 more Sudanese people infected by polio. Now I'm going to the resolution of conflict section. An agreement was reached between the government of Sudan and the SPLM in 2002, known as the Machakos Protocol, named after the city in Kenya where the ceasefire took place. The negotiations continued the following year, and the Sudanese government and the SPLA finally signed a comprehensive peace agreement on January 9, 2005, which brought an end to the civil war. In December of 2009, leaders of North and South Sudan reached a deal in terms of referendum on Independence Day in the South Sudan by 2011. And in addition to this, Independence Day was established as July 9th.